Hi. It's nice to see folks here. Interesting landing today when I flew in. You guys have some weather out here, I guess. Thank you for coming and paying attention to this subject tonight. Thanks to the Clinton School. I'm just so glad to be here. And I think my plan is maybe to talk for about half an hour, and it might at some point seem like the stories I'm telling are a litany of sadness from these wars, but I prefer that you think of them as a litany of trying, of some very good people who are trying hard, first in the wars and now to recover from them. You know, maybe the best way to start is by telling you about something that's not in either of my books. I'm a journalist. I've been at this story for 7 years, since early 2007, basically obsessing on it. And so let me tell you a quick story about how a journalist knows he's reached the point where he's done with his story. If you read this book, that book, and I hope you do, you're going to spend a lot of time with a guy named Adam Schuman, who I met in Iraq and then spent a lot of time with back in the States. And at some point, Adam had to go into a mental health treatment program in Northern California to deal with his psychological wounds. So the kind of reporting I do is it's not where something has happened and I go do interviews to figure out what happened. It's more observational where I report on something as it's happening. I go along, I hang out, and in this case, when Adam Schuman graduated from this program, he and his wife then got in their car. Their plan was to drive back to Fort Riley, Kansas, where they were living. And my plan was to just get in the back seat and go with them. And so that's what we did. He graduates around 6 at night. They get in the car and they start driving, and they don't have a lot of money. And then their plan really is to just keep driving straight through. And that's what they do, except for occasional stops for gasoline, bottles of water. They just keep going. And I don't know, 1, 2 in the morning, somewhere in Utah, dark as can be, nothing's really going on. I did the thing a reporter's not supposed to do. I fell asleep in the back seat. And to give you an idea of how nice that Adam Schuman is, he realized I was asleep, and he also realized that he had to pee. And he was concerned that if he pulled over, it would wake me up. So he just kept driving, and he did the old Iraq trick where he just peed into an empty water bottle as he drove. Now, the reason I know this is sometime after that, still in the middle of the night, I woke up in the back seat, and I was a little thirsty. And so I kind of reached around in the dark till I got my water bottle, and I unscrewed the lid and took a big swallow, and soon after that, I thought, I am so done with the reporting of this book. That's just, in fact, I remember texting my wife, because I didn't want to let them know I'd done this. And I sent her a text saying, I'll explain later, but how bad is it to drink human urine? And a little later, she's on the East Coast, I get this text back from her saying, I've checked it out on the web. It looks like you can drink your own urine once and you'll be okay. And I wrote back, I'll explain later. Anyway, so that's not in the book. What is in the book are very intimate stories about families trying to recover from having been part of these wars. It's a book about the war, about war soldiers, about wives of war soldiers, children of war soldiers, widows of war soldiers. It's a piece of journalism, and it's agenda-free, but that doesn't mean it's not an emotional book. I think it is an emotional book, and it's a book that I hope lives up to what this great author, Ben Fountain, said of it in a quote for the cover. This is a book that'll piss you off and break your heart. And I hope that's the case. I first met Adam. Let me show you a picture of this guy. In 2007, when I went to Baghdad during the period known as the Surge to write a book, not about the Iraq War, but to use the war to write about the character of young men who were sent into a war at a particular moment. And if you think back to 2007, the moment the Iraq War seemed to have arrived at was widely presumed to be the lost moment of the war. And in many ways, it was up on the edge of the tragic moment. And George W. Bush went on TV on January 10th, 2007, and announced this new thing called the Surge. In go more troops. And in Fort Riley, Kansas, there was a guy named Ralph Koslerich, a lieutenant colonel, in charge of an infantry battalion of 800 guys, who they had just been reimagined into an a surge battalion, a combat battalion in the surge. And he was watching this thing where Bush at one point said, many listening tonight will wonder what the difference will be this time. Well, here are the differences. And as he went on to enunciate the differences, this guy Koslerich in Fort Riley is thinking, we're going to be the difference. My soldiers, my battalion, and me. And a couple of weeks later, off he and his 800 young soldiers went, average age 19, most on their first deployment, filled with a young man's invincibility. They were going to go, they were going to win the thing, nothing bad was going to happen to them, they got to go to war. And then they lost their first guy, and then they lost their second guy, and they weren't invincible, and the injuries kept adding up, and at some point, you know, what happened is war happened, and the invincibility was replaced by a sense of maturity, in some ways of degradation, certainly of transformation. And when they came home 15 months later, no surprise, they were changed by the experience, and they continued to deal with that. Schumann was widely regarded as one of the very best soldiers in this battalion. And there was a day I was asking around, there was a quiet period, and I was saying, so who's the soldier I need to talk to? And some officer said, this guy Schumann, he's great. A couple weeks went by, I went to find Schumann, I walked in to find this great soldier, and that's who I saw. This rather gaunt, haunted-looking man sitting alone on his bunk, and I introduced myself, and he said, I guess I know why you're here. I said, well, I'm here because, you know, I hear you're one of the best. And he says, and he kind of laughed and said, well, maybe I am, but I'm going home today. And what had happened is after he was on his third deployment, he had been in combat, this very peculiar combat, for about 1,000 days. And the accumulation of everything was that he cracked open and he couldn't do it anymore. And look, we could sit here all night and talk about the policies of these wars, but these aren't policy books. These are about people who were sent to these wars to carry out policy. And by every measure, Schumann had done extraordinarily well. And yet, when he walked to the helicopter out of the war, the guy was just cloaked in such a deep sense of guilt and shame that it was an astonishing thing to see. I mean, the way I wrote about it in The Good Soldiers, very quickly, is his stomach hurt as he made his way across the FOB. He felt himself becoming nauseated. At the landing area, other soldiers from other battalions were lined up, and when the helicopter landed, everyone was allowed to board except him. He didn't understand. Next one's yours, he was told. And when it came in a few minutes later, he realized why he'd had to wait. It had a big red cross on the side. It was the helicopter for the injured and the dead. That was him, Adam Schumann. He was injured, he was dead, he was done. And off he went, home. And I stayed through the deployment, came home, wrote The Good Soldiers. It came out, and I thought, you know, I was done. And then I began hearing from people who had been in this battalion saying they weren't doing so well. Not all of them, but a good number. And they talked about feelings of anxiousness. They weren't sleeping well. They were on meds. A few acknowledged depression. There was a suicide attempt or two. And, you know, it dawned on me that if I'm such a crackerjack journalist, that what I had done in The Good Soldiers was tell half a story. And the other half is the story that's going on now, the recovery story. And Schumann, in many ways, is, and his wife Saskia, and I should show you Saskia, are the people you'll be spending the most time with in this book. Not entirely, but the most time. And here's how Thank You for Your Service begins. 2 years later, Adam drops the baby. The baby, who is 4 days old, is his son, and there is a moment as he is falling that this house he has come home to seems like the most peaceful place in the world. Outside is the cold dead of 3 a.m. on a late November night in Kansas. But inside is lamplight, the warm smell of a newborn, and Adam's wife Saskia, beautiful Saskia, who a few minutes before had asked her husband if he could watch the baby so she could get a little sleep. "I got it," he'd said. She curled up in the middle of their bed, and the last thing she glimpsed was Adam reclined along the edge, his back against the headboard and the baby in his arms. He was smiling, as if contentment for this wounded man were possible at last, and she believed it enough to shut her eyes just before he shut his. His arms soon relaxed. His grip loosened. The baby rolled off of his chest and over the edge of the bed, and here came that peaceful moment, the baby in the air, Adam and Saskia asleep, everyone oblivious, the floor still a few inches away, and now, with a crack followed by a thud, the moment is over and everything that will happen is underway. Saskia is the one who hears it. It is not loud, but it's loud enough. Her eyes fly open. She sees Adam closed-eyed and empty-armed, and only when he hears screaming and feels the sharp elbows and knees of someone scrambling across him does he wake up from the sleep he had promised he didn't need. It takes him a second or two, then he knows what he has done. He says nothing. There is nothing he can say. He is sorry. He is always sorry now. He has been sorry for 2 years, ever since he slunk home from the war. He watches his wife scoop up the baby. He keeps watching, wishing she would look at him, willing her to, always so in need of forgiveness, but she won't. She clutches the crying baby as he dresses and leaves the room. He sits for a while in the dark, listening to her soothe the baby, and then he goes outside, gets into his pickup truck, and positions a shotgun so that it is propped up and pointed at his face. In that way, he starts driving, while back in the house, Saskia is trying to understand what happened. A crack, a thud. The thud was the floor, and thank God for the ugly carpet. But what was the crack? The bed frame? The nightstand? This baby, so resilient, breathing evenly, not even a mark, somehow fine. Maybe he is one of the lucky ones, born to be okay. Saskia lies with him, then gets up and comes back with a plastic bottle of water. She drops it from the side of the bed and listens to the sound it makes as it hits the floor. She drops a pair of heavy shoes and watches them bounce. She finds a basketball and rolls it off the edge. She fills a drink container with enough water to weigh about as much as the baby. And as Adam continues driving and considering the gun, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet, she rolls that off the edge too. And the book goes on from there. You know, it's a rather brutal moment. The baby is okay, but the family isn't. But the family's trying to be okay. And look, it's not a book that's heavy on numbers, but let me give you a few. Since 9/11, there are about 2.5 million Americans who have been sent overseas in support of these two wars. And of the 2.5 million, about 2 million have gone directly into Iraq or Afghanistan, or both. Of the 2 million, 1.5 million are fine. They came home, they're okay. And in many cases, I know this anecdotally, and I'm sure if you know folks in the military, you know it too, in many cases, they are better for having served. But if the most recent best estimates are right, that leaves about 25% of the 2 million, or about 500,000 people who have come home back to America with some type of psychological wound that they're trying to recover from. Now, when the book came out a few months ago, at first, there was a little criticism by people saying, "Here I am, I'm just extending the stereotype that every soldier is a broken soldier, and that I'm doing a disservice." And I took, I thought about that, and it worried me. And I'm not trying to sound defensive here, but I think 500,000 is a significant number, multiplied by wives and husbands and boyfriends and girlfriends and parents and children. And if every county in America hasn't sent somebody into these wars, almost every county has. And the wars are ending, and they're home, and coast to coast, there are things underway like Adam and Saskia dropping a baby, driving around, trying to recover. These folks, forgive me if I sound like I'm pleading too much, but I want you to understand that the folks in this book, they aren't the extreme. I know as a journalist, the extreme always makes a good story, but there's no resonance in the extreme because most of us don't live in the extreme. We live in the middle of life. And most of the people I write about, they may not be the exact center of the bell curve, but they're pretty close. So do understand that this is what's going on and will go on for some time in houses here in Arkansas and across the country as these people who were sent over there as part of a professional army to fight these wars, they've come home and they're trying to recover. So this is, there's nothing, I was saying earlier, it's journalism, there's nothing new. There are no headlines in these books. You go to war, in some cases it screws you up, you come home, you try to recover. It's an old story. What's new is, this isn't history. This is ongoing. These are people here, and their after war, as I call it, is underway. Yeah, and if I sound a bit pleading, it's because one thing I've learned from this book is it's hard to get people to pay attention. These have been unpopular wars. And so as a writer, how do I get people to pay attention? Well, I think in this case, what I decided to do was tell stories about these people with the hope that if I do a good enough job, that they're going to get inside you a little bit. You're going to be thinking about them. I'm going to take something abstract and make it specific, and you'll have these folks in mind. So, for you guys, your reward for coming tonight is I'm going to assume that some of you won't read the books. I want you to know about these folks, so I'm going to show some pictures, and I'm going to tell some stories, and then I'm going to be quiet, and I hope we can have some questions and some bright answers. I should point out, again, the book really is, the names are real, everything I'm describing happened. It's a piece of journalism, the book, and so do keep that in mind. So here's a guy named Michael Emery who, a couple months into the deployment of the 216 Infantry Battalion in East Baghdad, was up on a roof, and a sniper got a clean shot into his head. And so Emery went down on this rooftop, and it was interesting. I mean, it was somehow he didn't die. They had to get him down 3 flights of stairs to be medevaced out, and one of the things that got to Schumann is it was a weird building, and every time they Emery's a big guy, and every time they put him on the litter and started moving, it would tip, it would go a little cockeyed and crazy. So finally Schumann put Emery on his back in this kind of fireman's carry, I guess, and started huffing and puffing his way down 3 flights of stairs. And it just so happens from the angle of things that the blood coming out of Emery's head wound kept going into Adam Schumann's mouth. And 6 months later, when I took the picture you saw earlier of Schumann sitting in his bunk, this is a guy still tasting Emery's blood, and it was one of the things that came up. In Emery's case, he didn't die somehow. And he came home, first in Germany, then he was in Bethesda for a long time, and he kind of recovered, amazingly. And as I write in the book, the life afterward, he was supposed to die and didn't, was supposed to not walk and does, was supposed to not talk and does that too. He's a walking miracle, his chief doctor says, and then revises that. He's an absolute walking phenomenon to those who don't know differently. He was shot in the head, and the bullet ruined the part of his brain that regulates such things as emotions and impulse control. He has no sensation on his left side. He can't easily stand. He can't move his left foot or toes. He can't straighten his left arm. He can't wiggle his left fingers, wink his left eye. He is divorced now from Maria, the woman, that's Maria, by the way, the woman he was married to when he was in the hospital and who didn't leave his bedside. "I love you, baby," she would say over and over to him in those first days when he couldn't talk and barely move. Her and her damneth is what he says about what happened after that. He has a young daughter who was in the family truck one day when he all of a sudden went haywire, punched the rearview mirror, shattered the windshield. Now the daughter has gone to Texas with her mother, and he is grateful, so she doesn't have to grow up around a man such as himself. Now he telephones his daughter every day from a safe distance. My little giraffe, he calls her. He has an aide who helps him with his leg brace, his arm brace, his hand brace, his clothing, his shoes that she double knots, his medications, and his food. Sometimes when she takes him to lunch in the nearby town, he asks her to dress him in a t-shirt that says, "What have you done for your country?" on the front, and "I took a bullet in the head for mine" on the back, so people who stare at him won't think they're looking at the results of some drunk in a car wreck. He was suicidal for a while, but isn't so much anymore. One time when he wasn't yet walking, he tried to tip over his wheelchair, hoping he would bang his head hard enough on the floor to die. One time, his last attempt, he tried to bite through his wrists. He's not as angry anymore either, he says, although sometimes he is. And he's not as depressed anymore, although sometimes he is that too. Mostly, he is alone, just alone. And sometimes he thinks about how he joined the Army to become a mechanic, and if he hadn't switched jobs, none of this would have happened. So it's no one's fault but his own. Everybody tells me, "It's not my fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault." Yes, it is, he says. You know, there's an interesting thing I just was thinking about. The loneliness is quite profound, and anybody who served in combat understands that eventually what the mission becomes is, it's not the mission, it's the guy next to you. It's this kind of tenderness and love for the guy next to you, even if he's an idiot. But there's a deep camaraderie. But when you come home, when you're doing the after war, believe me, most of these guys, they're pretty much on their own. This is Amanda Doster, and the death of her husband, James, was one of the things that so affected Adam Schumann as well. And obviously it affected her. And, you know, if there's something in common for all these folks, it is some really interesting sense of if not shame, of guilt over something, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. In Amanda Doster's case, it's that 3 years after her husband died, she's not over it. And everybody's saying, "Come on, enough already." But she can't get over it, to the point where she's driving around her little town in Kansas one day, and she gets to a stoplight, and she looks at the car next to her, and it's a pest control truck. And she looks at the driver, and it's him, it's her husband, it's James. And she gets it. Just like that, she understands what's happened. He didn't die. He left the war. He came home. He got a job. He's working pest control. He's just going to drive a truck for a while and save enough money, and then one day he's going to come to the door where the last time the door chimed, it was the casualty assistance officer saying he was dead, and this time it's going to be him. And then the light changes, and then it's, you know, it's another day of trying to wonder, why can't she get better? It's interesting. The death benefit she got, on her bad day, she calls it blood money, and on her better day, she calls it oops money. Here's a guy who I think if any of us served, we would hope to be this guy. How do I explain this? So Tasola was in a Humvee one day that was blown sky high. And a couple of years later, after coming home, he had to spend 7 weeks in the PTSD program, where he was called a hero again and again and asked to write about what he had done in the war as a way of making sense of what happened. So he did. He wrote 53 pages about what happened after the boom. The Humvee rising in the air, the concussion of the bomb, opening the door and trying to run, collapsing with a broken leg. I mean, the guy blows up. And I can tell you from having been in these explosions, in these first moments, nothing makes sense. It's noise and smoke and dust, and you don't know if you're alive or you're dead, and you're patting yourself to see if you're intact. And this guy, at some point, realizes he has to get out of the Humvee. He's been blown up. And he gets out of it with 2 broken legs, opening the door, trying to run, collapsing with that leg, limping back to the Humvee and pulling out a bloody soldier, pulling out a second one who was moaning and even bloodier as the Humvee sparked and burst into flames, collapsing again, relieved that everyone was out, and then hearing someone yell Harrelson's name. And it hit me. Oh shit, Harrelson. I forgot all about him, he had written. I looked over, and all I could see was flames and the outline of a body where he was at in the driver's seat. Over and over, he had written about it all, except for the one thing he has told no one, a dream he's been having ever since, Harrelson on fire, asking him, why didn't you save me? The dream would come every few nights. He never dreams about the soldiers he did save, only about Harrelson, and only in that way. For a while he could handle it, and then one day he couldn't. If you read the book, you'll read a woman named Christy Robinson. Unfortunately, in her case, her husband came home and he did take his life. And right afterwards, she was trying to make sense of, what happened. So this was just a little scene at the funeral. She went up to the casket and held his hand for a while. She used her fingers to brush his hair. She took a seat in the first pew, and while Summer crawled, that's Summer, her daughter, and while Summer crawled around her legs, she thought about who her husband, Jesse, had been before he died, before he kneeled in his own blood, before he sent her so many texts that began with the word please, before he thought about punching her nose and watching it bleed, before he needed the towels folded a certain way, before he saw a pink mist, before he had held a skull together, before he went to war. She thought all the way back to the beginning, when she was at that church dinner, so bored, and he took the seat across from her. What do you do, she asked. Paperwork, he said. That's all it took. One routine question, one silly answer, and right then she felt herself tipping over the edge and falling in love. Just like that. No way to explain it. It just happened. And that was her lesson learned this day, a reminder that she had married a wonderful man. Well, you'll meet Pete Corelli in the book. Really, really interesting guy. He helped run the war in Iraq for a while, came home, was promoted to Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. His brief included mental health issues. And every month, he would convene a meeting deep in the Pentagon called a Suicide Senior Review Group. And basically, it was maybe 20 people around the table, video link-ups around the world, and wherever there had been a suicide. And a commanding general at a particular place would have 5 minutes to explain what happened and what the lessons learned were. And one of the lessons learned was that in a 2-hour briefing, that's not quite enough time to keep up with all the suicides they had to talk about. Okay, let me get toward the end. bear with me. Look at all I didn't read. One of the things the Army has done to try to help the people who have come back and need special attention is they've established these things called warrior transition battalions, where you basically go out of your unit and for a while, in theory anyway, you get very good extra attention that either to ultimately be returned to your unit or prepared for life after the military. So people who go in would meet a guy at Fort Riley. One of the first guys they'd meet was a guy named Tim Jung. Tim Jung, one of the people in charge of new arrivals at the WTB, the unit where the wounded were sent to recover. The wide-eyed, the nervous-eyed, the closed-eyed, the dead-eyed, they all start out with Tim Jung, a friendly, gum-chewing, boyish-looking sergeant first class who one day, without telling anyone, goes for a drive by himself into the Kansas countryside. 15 miles from the WTB, he pulls into a dirt parking area next to the Big Blue River. It's late afternoon, and not many people are around, but just to be sure he won't be interrupted, he decides to go to the far side of the river. He climbs an embankment and starts across a long train trestle. If a train comes, there won't be much he can do, but at this point it hardly matters. He has plenty of sleeping pills with him and blank paper on which to write letters to his children. His plan is simple: write the letters, swallow the pills, wade into the river, and let the water take it from there. It's hard to say what has brought him to this point. Probably, like so many cases he's seen at the WTB, it's not one thing in particular, but an accumulation of everything. On the far side now, no train, he'll have to do it himself. He walks south along the river's edge until he finds a place to sit. The air has that damp, moldy smell of mud and ripe leaves, but he doesn't mind it. He takes out the paper and a pen and wonders in his life's last moments what to write of all that has happened. A life of soldiering, a long marriage that failed, a period of cancer treatments. Any one of them could be its own letter. But what he chooses instead for his final words are the thoughts of a father who is proud of his children and knows absolutely that they will go on to accomplish great things. He writes for a while in the stink of the river until he is sure he has written something okay for his children to read and reread in a lifetime of trying to drown out the noise of what he's about to do. And then he gets the pills ready and takes a look around the spot he has chosen. He's looking west into a setting sun that seems to be lighting the river on fire. It is beautiful, he allows himself to think. And as he keeps looking, he takes notice of the river's current, which strikes him as beautiful too. He watches some water bugs skimming along the surface and some birds riding the late afternoon drafts. There are crickets also pining away in the grasses and weeds, and whereas a few minutes before he was hearing and seeing none of this, now he sits with pills in hand and letters next to him, transfixed. The crickets keep singing. The water keeps moving. The sun keeps dropping. It's beautiful, he keeps thinking. And in that little bit of hesitation, something inside of him turns or recedes or cracks open or does whatever happens when someone no longer wants to die, because when at last he stands up, it is to go gratefully away from the river, back across the trestle, back home to hide the letters in the desk drawer, and back to the WTB, where the new arrivals keep coming and coming and coming, all of them headed to the river. So who are they? Who are these people headed to the river, right? You know, what happened? What happened over there in these places we don't pay attention to that's so bad that they come back here and they finally sometimes acknowledge needing help recovering? Well, as I write in the book, they are the ones home from a war where every day would begin the same way. The soldiers would tuck Lucky Charms into their pockets and joke about their final words. They would gather in quick circles to pray and smoke the last cigarette of their lives. They would tighten their body armor, push in their earplugs, lower their shatter-resistant sunglasses, and tug on their burn-resistant gloves. And when someone called out, "Let's go," They would climb into their Humvees and go, knowing full well what was waiting for them down the road. They had seen Harrelson's Humvee rise into the air and burst into fire. They had seen Emory get shot in the head and collapse in his own spreading blood. They had seen soldiers lose legs, lose arms, lose feet, lose hands, lose fingers, lose toes, and lose eyes. And they had heard them too in the aid station in whatever pain is enough pain to make a 19-year-old scream. They had heard a soldier ask, "Is anything sticking out of my head?" after a mortar attack. They had heard a doctor say, I'm hoping," about a soldier who in a few minutes would be dead. They had heard a soldier tell a dying soldier as he stuffed what was left of him into a Humvee, "You're going to have to move your feet so I can close the door." They had heard a soldier who had lost his right leg and right arm and most of his left arm saying, "Ow, it hurts, it hurts." They had heard a sergeant who was watching something skid across the floor of the aid station, which had fallen from a shredded soldier who was about to die, say with sadness, "That's a toe." Most of all, they had heard explosion after explosion and seen dozens of Humvees disappear into breathtaking clouds of fire and debris. And by the end, most of them had been inside such a cloud themselves, blindly feeling around in those initial moments to determine if they were alive or dead or intact or in pieces, as their ears rang and their hearts galloped and their souls darkened and their eyes occasionally filled with tears. So they knew. And yet day after day they would go out anyway, which eventually came to be what the war was about. Not winning, not losing, nothing so grand, just trying, and then trying again until it was time to come home and discovering that life after the war would be very much the same, a life about trying. So look, there's more to the book, believe it or not, and there's stories about these people, and I hope I've told them well enough that you'll care about them. I think stories matter. I think these stories matter. I think you folks listening to these stories matters a lot. I know it matters to them because every time I talk, I'll get an email or a message from somebody saying, "So, anybody show up? Anybody paying attention?" And tonight I'll get to tell them some people showed up and some people paid attention. And I really appreciate that. So let's move on to some questions if there are. I hope there are some, and I hope they're not polite, because the tougher they are, the more engaged we all are as well. But thanks for listening to that part.
Okay, we do have time for questions, so raise your hands.
Please, don't be shy.
Yeah, here's one right here.
I just wondered if you think that more people would be more interested if we had a citizen army instead of a professional army.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. You talk to the guys who are in, and of course, they don't want that. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them just, they kind of like it the way it is. But it's hard to argue with that point, right? It's, this is, if it's 2.5 million Americans, I mean, just do the math. Less than 1% of American households have had a direct stake in these wars. Professional force in these faraway countries, and it's not like they were shutting factories down, right, to build MRAPs to replace Humvees that were getting blown up by these roadside bombs. So there wasn't a whole lot of sacrifice, and you're not the first person to say that if there were mandatory service, more people would have been engaged with the war and this part as well.
Sir, in your opinion, what is the root of the disconnect between most Americans and the military? Why have we become so militaristic and seem to have to get our nose in everything? Yeah,
so let me think of how many ways I can give you an unsatisfactory answer. I'm pretty shy about giving my opinions. I think one of the reasons the books have succeeded is because I kept myself out of them, that I deferred to the opinions of the people who are doing the fighting. Those, you know, their take matters. Their take, anecdotally, reflects the previous question. People aren't engaged because they don't have to be engaged. You got a kid over there, suddenly you're paying attention, right? A neighbor, you pay some attention, but if you don't know anybody and you're not really having to make much of a sacrifice, why pay attention at all? I think the previous question is your answer.
Yes, right here.
Hi, I wanted to know, what do you think is the biggest, where the most promise lies in stemming this tide? What, in your opinion, interesting that you...
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. The most promise in...
Stemming the tide of what these guys are coming, and people are coming home with, is there any promise that you see specific?
Yeah, time, I guess, right? Time tends to heal. I mean, what we're... If you believe estimates from previous wars, this is not extraordinary, 25%. That's pretty much in keeping with previous wars. This is if you can, believe the surveys. But it always seems to be between 20 and 30%. And, people get better, whether it's military or civilian life. Let me change the question a bit. Not stemming the tide, but what's our obligation? Maybe this gets to your question as well. What is to be done for the folks who served well and now aren't feeling well? What do we owe them? And so, one difference between this war and the preceding ones is that at least there's now some system in place to help someone who says, I think I need some help. That didn't exist. It exists now, but the people in the system aren't going to be shy about telling you it's ad hoc and haphazard and overwhelmed, and it may be populated by people with good intentions, but that doesn't mean that everybody gets great help. So three guys whose pictures I showed you. So first there's Tesolo Ayeti. He's the guy who was blown up and starts having this bad dream until he destroys his apartment and he needs to be hospitalized and helped. He goes into a VA-run program for PTSD. It's a 7-week program, okay? He's there for 7 weeks dealing with this, taking it on. Another guy I didn't talk about, but his picture, he was a guy kind of sitting at the end of a long barrel. He needed help for various reasons, and he wanted to go into the 7-week program. And first of all, I'm going to give you a long answer. First of all, it's so hard anyway getting these guys to say out loud they need help. It's a small window. These are rough and tough guys. They don't want to acknowledge a mental wound in a lot of cases. When Adam Schuman came home and he got off the plane in Manhattan, Kansas, was walking across the tarmac, he was walking across just wishing as hard as he could wish for anything that he was truly coming home as a great soldier, which meant missing a leg, being shot up, having some physical representation that he had been in war and was wounded. And instead, he's perfectly symmetrical, and he looks in the mirror and he thinks, everybody tells me there's something wrong with me. I look the same. I don't believe there's anything wrong with me. So when a guy will ask for help, the window is so small and so many things can go wrong. But okay, so Ayeti gets 7 weeks. Nick Danino gets 4 weeks because the 7-week program is full. So his caseworker looks around and finds one with an opening, but this one is sort of guided by insurance guidelines. All right, so he doesn't get 7 weeks, he gets 4 weeks. That's just the way it goes. Adam Schuman finally reaches the point where he needs help. 7-week program is full. The 4-week program is full. So his caseworker looks around and finds this little thing in Northern California that isn't part of the VA, that is not funded by insurance. It's this kind of small thing that's entirely donor supported. And the guy who runs that says, you come here, you stay 4 months minimum, and as long as it takes. So that's the system, right? One guy gets 7 weeks, one guy gets 4 weeks, one guy gets 4 months and up. And it's not because of the nature of their injury, it's because of who has the opening. And I just said, well, anyway, if I had a kid who served and came home and needed help, and I found out that, oh, he's in the 7-week program, great. Oh, there's a 4-month program? You just want a system, I guess, to be a little less overwhelmed and making a little more sense than it does. It's a long answer, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am, we have a question, and she'll get the microphone to you.
I just wanted to mention one thing to you, 2 things. One is that my father was in the Second World War, and I'm a Vietnam era person. And because I was busy getting married and having babies, it sort of went right past me. But what I can't get over is, first of all, how difficult it is as a person to volunteer at a VA. I spent 2 years trying to get into Walter Reed all the way from San Francisco, and they said there's a waiting list of 4 years for people who want to go and help. I've tried here in Little Rock for a year. I just got into the VA. So I want you to go back and tell these guys who ask you what our reaction was tonight. There's not a person in this room, and if you multiply us by 10 each, who aren't involved, who don't care, who aren't paying attention. When we turn on the TV, we see it. I'm part of Wounded Warriors.
Right.
I bet everybody is. And I want you to tell them they're wrong. I think we all care a lot. We have our jobs to do, just like they did for us. But I've never talked to anybody who doesn't wish we could help and make these men and women know how much we love them and how much we appreciate
Well, that's great. That's great. And I will say that. And it's good to hear that you've been trying to volunteer. Sometimes when I talk, a common question will be, so what can I do? What can I do? And I say, it's not up to me to tell you what to do. It's, I did the part I can do, which is pay attention and write about them, but it's up to you really to figure it out. And so good for you. There's no shortage of work to be done. I was just talking last week to it's a really interesting organization called Give an Hour, and it's I think she said the person who runs it maybe 10,000 or so people at this point, but they're psychologists, therapists, social workers across the country who sign up and will be matched basically with somebody in their area who just wants somebody to talk to. And so, they do it for free, come on over, and maybe they build a relationship. So there are lots of people who are trying to help in genuine ways. So that's a nice thing to know.
Well, I know there are more questions, and I'm going to encourage you to answer them and ask them when he is over signing this book. This is a great book, and I know that the stories that he highlighted, certainly many people in this room know people in Arkansas with similar experiences. Let's thank David Finkel for being here, and thank you for our service. Thank you.